Her whisper slipped through the pantry door just as Ethan reached for the light. The words were so soft they should have disappeared into the hum of the refrigerators, into the clatter of silver trays being stacked for the night, into the tired breathing of a hotel kitchen after another 12-hour shift. But they did not. They landed cleanly in the dark between them. I wish someone would choose me. Clara Bennett did not know anyone was there. She stood with her back to the narrow door, one hand braced against a metal shelf, the other curled around a paper inventory sheet already damp from her grip. Her black uniform was plain, the hem slightly frayed, the white apron tied too tightly around a waist grown thinner from skipped meals and double shifts. In the dim spill of light from the hallway, her shoulders looked smaller than they had an hour ago when she'd moved through the banquet room like she was trying not to take up any space at all. Ethan Vale froze with his hand still lifted. He had come downstairs to escape the noise of his own engagement party. That was the kind of sentence newspapers loved. Billionaire investor. Hotel owner. 38. Disciplined. Untouchable. Newly engaged to a woman whose family name opened doors in 3 states, and whose smile photographed beautifully beside his. Upstairs, crystal glasses had been raised in his honor. Deals had been hinted at over champagne. His mother had looked relieved. His fiancée, Vanessa, had looked victorious. And yet he had walked away from all of it because something in that ballroom had felt rehearsed down to the last laugh. Now he stood in the back hall of his own flagship hotel, expensive suit jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened, staring through a pantry doorway at a woman who had no idea the man she served belonged to the world that kept overlooking her. Clara lowered her head, embarrassed by her own confession even in private. Just once, she whispered to no one. Not as the safe choice. Not as the extra shift. Not because someone needs something. The room went still. Ethan had spent years hearing people ask to be chosen. Partners wanted access. Investors wanted trust. Women wanted proximity to his name. Even his fiancée wanted selection, though she had dressed it up as compatibility. But this was different. There was no performance in Clara's voice. No calculation. No audience. Only hunger. Not for money. Not for rescue. For worth. He should have stepped away. A decent man would have given her privacy. A careful man would have remembered who he was upstairs, what announcement was waiting to be made before midnight, what family expectations had already hardened around him like cement. Instead, he stayed very still. Earlier that night he had noticed her in passing, though he had not meant to. She had caught a tray before it crashed, quietly fixed a floral arrangement knocked crooked by a careless guest, and offered her own dinner break to an older dishwasher whose hands were shaking from low blood sugar. No one thanked her. No one even looked twice. Vanessa had looked once, only to complain that the help should move faster around Couture. Ethan had heard that too. He heard more now than he wanted to. A sharp burst of laughter snapped through the hallway. Clara straightened immediately, swiping under one eye before any tear could fall. The pantry door swung wider, and 2 women from the party drifted past with half-empty champagne flutes, their satin dresses whispering against the tile. One of them glanced in and wrinkled her nose. "There you are," she said to Clara. "Vanessa's table needs fresh napkins. Try not to disappear when people are working." Clara nodded. "Yes, ma'am." No anger. No defense. Just obedience polished by necessity. Ethan felt something cold shift inside him. The woman did not see him in the shadows. Neither did her friend. They moved on, laughing, already done with the damage. Clara took one slow breath, folded the inventory sheet into a square, and reached for the stacked linens beside her. The linen scraped against Clara's palms, crisp and dry, while laughter from the dining room drifted through the service corridor like something warm she was not allowed to touch. Overhead, one fluorescent bulb buzzed with a faint electric tremor. Beyond the swinging kitchen door, silverware chimed. Wine glasses met in bright little notes, and the estate moved with the easy confidence of money that had never been denied anything. In that narrow strip between the pantry and the ballroom, Clara stood invisible again, except to the one man who had heard what no one else was meant to hear. Not far away, Ethan remained half-hidden in the shadow beside the archway, his tuxedo jacket still buttoned, one hand resting loosely at his side. He had arrived at his own charity dinner expecting speeches, handshakes, and another polished evening where everyone praised generosity under crystal chandeliers. Instead, he had heard a whisper spoken to no audience at all. I wish someone would choose me. The words did not leave him. Clara lifted the stack of napkins, balanced them carefully against her hip, and started toward the private dining alcove reserved for Vanessa and her guests. Her steps were precise, almost soundless, the kind learned by people who survive by taking up as little space as possible. There was no self-pity in her face now. That hurt him more. Shame, he could have answered. Tears, he would have understood. But this quiet acceptance, the calm of a woman already trained not to expect rescue, settled somewhere under his ribs and stayed there. At the alcove, Vanessa was leaning back in her chair with a champagne flute between two manicured fingers, surrounded by women wearing silk, diamonds, and expressions sharpened by boredom. The table glowed under candlelight. Clara approached with lowered eyes and fresh linens folded like white envelopes. Finally, Vanessa said, not even looking at her at first, "Set them down, and try not to hover. You make the whole corner feel sad." A few of the women laughed. Clara obeyed. That should have been the end of it. In houses like this, cruelty usually passed as etiquette, and the help was expected to absorb it without leaving a stain. But Ethan did not move away. He watched Clara place each napkin with steady hands. He watched one guest glance at her black dress, then at her face, as if assessing whether loneliness itself had a uniform. He watched Clara swallow whatever rose in her throat and keep working. Then the smallest break in the pattern came, not from him, but from her. One of Vanessa's friends let her clutch slide from the edge of the table. Lipstick, a phone, and a folded envelope spilled onto the floor. Clara bent immediately to gather them. As she reached for the envelope, the flap opened just enough for her to see the top line on the stationery inside. Placement confirmation. Ridgeway Family Services. A child's name beneath it. Clara froze for less than a second, but Ethan saw it. Vanessa snatched the paper from her hand. "Don't read what isn't yours." "I'm sorry," Clara said quietly, rising. But her face had changed. Not with offense. With recognition. Ethan's gaze sharpened. Ridgeway Family Services was not a name most people in this room would know. It was a private placement agency, one his foundation had audited 2 years ago for coercive adoption practices before burying the scandal in legal settlements. Vanessa's late brother had once served on the board. A different kind of silence moved through him now. Not pity. Attention. Clara turned to leave, but Vanessa was not finished. "Actually, stay." She took a slow sip of champagne, then smiled toward her friends. "Tell them what you were doing in the garden earlier." "Go on." "The wishing part." The women looked up with immediate interest. The blood drained from Clara's face. Ethan took one step forward, then stopped. This was not yet his moment. Vanessa tilted her head. "You said something pathetic, didn't you? About wanting someone to choose you." Clara's fingers tightened around the empty silver tray. Crystal light broke across the champagne glasses and scattered over the terrace doors in thin, glittering lines, while the silence around Clara turned sharp enough to cut. Vanessa's voice still hung in the air, sweet with cruelty, inviting an audience to enjoy another woman's private wound. At the far end of the room, Ethan watched Clara's knuckles whiten around the silver tray, watched the way she kept her spine straight even as humiliation reached for her in public. He had seen enough power games in boardrooms to recognize one instantly, and this one disgusted him more because the person under attack had no armor at all. Clara lifted her chin by less than an inch. "I was doing my job in the garden," she said quietly. Vanessa laughed. "That's not what I asked." A few guests smiled into their glasses, relieved not to be the target. The band inside the ballroom drifted into a slow piano passage, absurdly elegant against the small cruelty unfolding beside the open doors. Clara could feel every eye pressing against her skin. The damage here was different now. Not just embarrassment. Exposure. Once a room decided your longing was entertainment, dignity became something you had to defend barehanded. Then Ethan moved. Not quickly. Not dramatically. The restraint made it louder. He crossed the polished stone floor with one hand still tucked in his pocket, his expression unreadable, and stopped beside the tray station as if he belonged in this exact square of air. Which he did. The conversations nearest him thinned at once. "I need a fresh bottle from the private cellar," he said, looking at Clara, not Vanessa. "You know the inventory routes better than anyone tonight. Walk me through it." The room blinked. It was such an ordinary sentence that no one could challenge it without sounding foolish. Yet everyone heard what it truly was. A clean exit offered without forcing Clara to beg for one. Vanessa's smile faltered for half a beat. Clara stared at Ethan, uncertain whether this was rescue, courtesy, or a more polished form of pity. "Yes, sir," she said at last. The service corridor swallowed the music behind them. Fluorescent light replaced gold candlelight. Chilled air brushed the back of Clara's neck. The wheels of a forgotten cart clicked softly as they passed. For the first time all evening, no one was watching her face. That privacy alone felt almost dangerous. Ethan matched his pace to hers. "The key cabinet is downstairs." She nodded. "Near receiving." That was ugly back there. The words were plain, without performance, and that made them harder to dismiss. Clara kept her eyes ahead. People with money often apologize to suffering the way they tip too much after being rude, briefly, cleanly, and from a safe height. She had learned not to mistake a decent moment for dependable character. "It happens," she said. "It shouldn't." The answer landed with more force than he intended. He heard it himself and let the silence settle rather than soften it. Ahead, the narrow stairwell dropped into the lower level of the hotel, where the smell changed from perfume and wine to cardboard, detergent, and cold metal. Clara reached the key cabinet, unlocked it, and took out the brass tag for the cellar cage. Her hand trembled only once. Ethan noticed. He also noticed that she seemed angrier at her own trembling than at Vanessa's cruelty. That, more than anything, told him how long she had been training herself to survive in dignity without witnesses. In the cellar, rows of bottles rested in shadow behind wire mesh. Clara stepped inside the cage and reached for the vintage listed on the event sheet. Ethan stayed outside at first, watching the care in her movements, the precision, the quiet competence no one had applauded upstairs because competence from someone like Clara was treated as background furniture. Wealth had made him fluent in 1,000 forms of entitlement. Tonight, for the first time in a long while, he felt ashamed of how often men like him benefited from silence they did not create but never interrupted. The service hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and melted butter, a strange mix of luxury and labor, and the air felt cooler there than it had in the ballroom, where humiliation still lingered like perfume. Behind the swinging door, the music from the terrace came through softened and distant, strings and laughter reduced to a muffled blur that no longer belonged to Clara. On the stainless steel prep counter beside her sat a folded event sheet, 2 missing dessert spoons, and the empty silver tray she had carried like a shield. What had happened upstairs had left a tremor in her hands, but not in her posture. She was still standing straight, still finishing the work, still refusing to let cruelty turn her into something smaller. From the doorway, a quiet voice entered before footsteps did. "You fixed a seating mistake no one else even noticed." Clara looked up too quickly, as if she had expected another wound. Instead, Ethan stood just inside the service hall, jacket unbuttoned now, the sharp edges of his wealth softened by something more uncertain. He was not smiling. Men like him often smiled when they wanted to make discomfort disappear without paying for what caused it. This was different. His expression carried the stiffness of someone used to arriving without power in his hand. "It was on the wrong table," Clara said, returning her eyes to the tray. "It needed to be corrected." "Not because it was your job," he said. That made her pause. Crystal light from the dining room caught along the side of his watch, then slipped across the metal counter between them like a line neither of them quite knew how to cross. Clara had spent enough years around rich people to recognize performance on sight. Apologies dressed up as charm. Interest that lasted 3 minutes. Kindness offered only when witnesses were nearby. But there was no audience here. Only the low hum of refrigeration, the buzz of one fluorescent bulb overhead, and a man choosing not to leave. "You heard what she said," Clara murmured. "I did. And you came now." A small truth landed between them. "I should have come sooner." The room went still. No defense. No explanation. No borrowed innocence. Just a clean admission, and because it was so rare, it unsettled her more than flattery would have. Clara finally faced him fully, searching for the angle, the hidden condition, the polite exit waiting behind his eyes. She did not find one. What she found instead was discomfort he had not delegated away. "I'm not asking you to make me feel better," she said. "I know." His voice lowered. "I think I'm the one who needed to feel worse." That almost pulled a startled breath from her. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan glanced at the event sheet on the counter, at the crossed-out timing notes and rewritten dessert sequence in careful handwriting. You reorganized the final service after the kitchen delay, he said. That was you too. Clara frowned slightly. How would you know that? Because I funded this event, he said, and because I asked why it didn't fall apart when half the staff was scrambling. There it was again, not praise tossed down like a coin, but attention. Precise. Earned. The kind that saw the work, then traced it back to the person. You notice a lot for someone who stayed outside the door, she said. The line could have cut him. Instead, he accepted it. I'm trying to do better than that. Then he did something no one in that house had done all evening. He reached past the silver tray, took the event sheet she had been using, and saw the stain spreading at the bottom corner where a carafe had leaked through earlier. The paper was softening, nearly unusable. Ethan folded it once, set it down, and took out his phone. Clara stiffened. If this is about replacing me. It isn't. His thumb moved quickly across the screen. A few seconds later, his assistant answered. Ethan's tone stayed calm, but there was steel under it now. The call lasted less than a minute, but by the time it ended, the air in the service hallway had changed. Not warmer, not kinder, just sharper, as if some invisible line had been drawn and everyone standing near it would soon have to decide which side they were on. Clara still held the damp event sheet in both hands, careful not to tear it. Her shoulders were square, but tension lived in the small details. The way her fingers pressed too hard into the paper, the way she kept her chin level only through effort. She had spent enough years working around wealthy people to recognize the tone Ethan had used on the phone. It was not comfort. It was correction. Somewhere beyond the kitchen doors, someone important was about to be inconvenienced, and in places like this, inconvenience traveled faster than truth. The first sign came 3 minutes later when a young floor manager in a black suit hurried down the hallway with a tablet clutched to his chest. He nearly skidded on the polished tile before stopping in front of Clara, suddenly out of breath, suddenly formal. His eyes flicked to Ethan, then back to her. "Ms. Bennett," he said, using her last name with a respect no one upstairs had bothered with earlier. "Mr. Vale has asked that you step away from beverage service for the remainder of the evening." Clara's stomach dropped. There it was. Not replacement, exactly. Just removal in prettier language. "I understand," she said quietly. "It's not disciplinary." The manager added too fast, which only made it sound more public. "You're being reassigned to guest coordination near the east veranda." The east veranda. Not hidden in the back. Not protected, either. Visible. A beat of silence passed before Ethan spoke. "She'll report directly to Mara." The manager nodded once, swallowed, and left. Clara turned toward Ethan then, the strain finally showing in her eyes. "You moved me out there?" "I moved you where no one gets to treat you like furniture," he said. The words should have steadied her. Instead, they made the problem larger. The east veranda was where donors lingered over bourbon and old money. Where wives noticed dresses. Where daughters noticed shoes. Where men measured women in a glance and called it manners. Out there, every missing detail in Clara's life would show under better lighting. "That isn't safer," she said. "No," Ethan answered. "It isn't." For a moment, that honesty struck deeper than reassurance could have. He was not pretending the world she had to walk into was gentle. He was only refusing to leave it unchanged. By the time Clara reached the veranda, night had settled fully over the estate, blue-black and expensive, with heat lamps glowing along the stone rail and crystal votives throwing soft gold across linen-draped cocktail tables. Beyond the garden, the city lights shimmered in the distance. Nearer at hand came the sound that did more damage than shouting ever could. Low voices, polished laughter, the intimate cruelty of people certain they belonged. Mara, the senior coordinator, handed Clara a guest list and spoke briskly enough to sound kind. "Just check names, direct anyone asking for transport, and don't let the Mercer table change their seating again." Clara nodded and got to work. For 20 minutes, competence carried her. She greeted arrivals, corrected a reservation error, arranged a car for an elderly couple, and found a missing wrap for a woman too distracted to thank her. Her movements were clean, precise, almost elegant. But efficiency could not stop recognition. It began with a whisper. Wasn't she serving drinks inside? Then another. "I think Ethan Vale pulled her out himself." A soft laugh. "That explains it." No accusation was stated plainly, which made each one harder to defend against. Eyes lingered. Smiles sharpened at the corners. A woman in pearl earrings looked Clara up and down and asked for champagne as if testing whether she still knew her place. When Clara explained, politely, that she was handling guest coordination now, the woman's brows lifted in theatrical surprise. How ambitious, she said. Crystal chandeliers spilled white light across the terrace, catching on champagne flutes, polished silver, and the careful smiles of people who had spent years perfecting the art of sounding harmless while drawing blood. The insult from the woman in pearls had barely faded when a fresh ripple moved through the crowd, subtle at first, then gathering shape as heads turned toward the doorway. A local lifestyle reporter had arrived with a camera crew no one had expected, all bright teeth and quick eyes, eager for candid moments from a charity evening hosted by one of the city's most private men. The timing could not have been worse. Clara had just accepted a seating chart update from one of the waiters when the reporter stepped backward without looking and knocked into a tray. Glass trembled. A coupe tipped. Pale gold champagne spilled in a glittering arc and splashed across the front of the reporter's silk blouse. A gasp rose, quick and delighted in the cruel way wealthy crowds sometimes enjoyed a mistake more than a speech. "I am so sorry," Clara said at once, reaching for napkins. But the reporter's expression changed the instant she recognized who stood in front of her. Not staff, exactly. Not guest, either. Something in between, vulnerable enough to use. "Oh," the woman said, loud enough for 3 nearby tables to hear. Then louder. "So this is her." The camera light swung before anyone could stop it. Ethan, halfway across the terrace in conversation with 2 donors, turned at the sound of his name. The reporter dabbed at her blouse and gave a knowing smile toward the lens. "People said Mr. Vale had a surprise tonight. I just didn't realize the surprise was so personal." The phrase landed like a match near dry leaves. A man near the bar laughed under his breath. Someone else murmured, "I knew it." The woman in pearls lifted her glass and looked almost pleased. In seconds, the story wrote itself across the terrace without a single fact needing to be checked. The quiet staff girl, suddenly elevated, the rich man's attention, the mysterious reassignment. Not competence, not trust. A prettier explanation. An uglier one. Clara felt the blood leave her face. Ethan was already moving toward them, his expression sharpened by the same cold stillness that had silenced boardrooms and broken negotiations. The crowd opened for him, not out of kindness, out of instinct. "This is not the place for speculation," he said. The reporter smiled like she had been handed proof instead of warning. "Then clarify it for us. The city loves a human story. A billionaire benefactor giving a struggling girl a new position. She works for this event because she earned it." Ethan cut in. Earned it. It should have helped. It should have landed like defense. Instead, the word struck Clara in the tenderest place, because of the way every face around them read it. As if he were trying too hard. As if he were covering something embarrassing with polished language. Worse, because pity had a tone she knew too well, and for one terrible second she heard it where it might not even have been. In his voice. In the hurried need to explain her place to people who would never have asked if she belonged there on her own. The reporter tilted her head. "Of course. That's very generous." Generous. There it was. Not chosen. Helped. Managed. Displayed. Clara's fingers tightened around the folded seating chart until the paper bent at the corners. Every old humiliation came back at once. The foster homes, the careful gratitude, the lesson that kindness often arrived with invisible strings and an audience. She had been foolish enough to think this felt different because Ethan had looked at her as if she were a person before he looked at her as a problem. Now the terrace had translated everything into a language she understood too well. He saw her face change. "Clara." "No," she said softly, and that softness made him stop more than anger would have. Her eyes did not fill. That would have been easier for them all. Around them, the party kept breathing in that eerie way wealthy rooms did after cruelty. Soft laughter resuming too quickly, glass touching glass. A violin somewhere near the garden doors pretending nothing irreversible had happened. The chandeliers still cast their expensive light over the terrace, but Clara no longer stood inside it. She stepped back from Ethan with a composure that was more devastating than any public scene could have been, set the guest list tablet on a narrow marble console, and removed the temporary event badge clipped to her dress as if it weighed more than gold. No one tried to stop her at first. That, somehow, was the final insult. The woman in pearl earrings turned away with a tiny smile, already satisfied. A man near the bar murmured something about people becoming confused when they were given too much encouragement. Another guest gave a sympathetic shrug, the kind that cost nothing and protected everyone. Clara heard all of it. She did not defend herself. That was the difference tonight. For weeks, she had worked inside this place with a careful kind of hope, not the dramatic sort, but the quiet, stubborn kind that made a person keep believing life might bend if they were patient enough, useful enough, gracious enough. She had let herself believe that Ethan's attention meant she had been seen, not displayed, not managed, seen. Now she understood the price of mistaking interest for courage. "I'll collect my things and be gone before dessert is served," she said, not loudly, not for the room, only for him. "No one will have to feel uncomfortable on my account." The words landed like a verdict. Ethan had negotiated hostile takeovers, stared down men who lied for a living, and built a reputation on never showing panic before it could be used against him. But this was not business, and there was no strategy in the sudden hollow opening under his ribs. He looked at the badge in her hand, then at the service corridor beyond the terrace doors, and for the first time all evening, he saw the entire line of his own failure with merciless clarity. Not what they had said, what he had allowed. Silence, dressed as control, was still silence. Distance, dressed as caution, was still abandonment. "Clara, wait." She shook her head once. "I have waited." 3 words, barely above a whisper. They struck harder than accusation. A server passing with a tray slowed, then moved on. A few guests pretended not to listen, which only made their listening more obvious. Ethan took a step forward, and Clara took one back, not frightened, not dramatic, simply decided. That small retreat changed the balance of the night more completely than any scene could have. Until now, he had believed time was still on his side. A conversation later. An explanation in private. A gentler moment. The luxury of delay belonged to him because he had always assumed she would still be there when he reached for it. She would not. In the staff locker room below the ballroom, fluorescent lights hummed over rows of dented metal doors and winter coats that smelled faintly of rain. Clara moved with steady hands, folding the plain cardigan she wore to and from work, placing it into her canvas tote beside a paperback novel, a half-empty hand lotion, and the envelope where she kept every extra dollar she could save. No tears came. Grief had passed through her too many times to always announce itself with weeping. Sometimes it arrived as order. Fold this. Zip that. Leave cleanly. Above her, music swelled again. Below it, footsteps approached fast, then stopped outside the half-open door. Ethan did not enter right away. For a man used to owning every room he walked into, the hesitation was almost brutal to watch. He stood at the threshold as if it were a border he had no right to cross without permission, his tuxedo jacket still immaculate, his face no longer protected by the expression that had carried him through the evening. "I should have stopped it the moment it began," he said. The silence inside that small room had a different weight than the silence outside. Out on the terrace, cruelty had been dressed in diamonds and laughter. In here, with the door half open and the music from the garden reduced to a thin ache in the distance, there was no place left for performance. Clara stood near the narrow table by the wall, one hand resting against its polished edge as if reminding herself that something in the world was still solid. The folded napkin she had been holding earlier was gone. So was the last fragile excuse that this night had merely bruised her pride instead of breaking something deeper. Across the threshold, Ethan did not move closer until she gave the smallest nod. It was not forgiveness. It was permission to speak. "I should have stopped it the moment it began," he said. Clara looked at him then, not with rage, but with the exhaustion that comes after hoping too long. "But you didn't." No defense survived those 3 words. His jaw tightened once, and for a second, he seemed like a man confronting a loss no money could negotiate with. The old instinct, to explain, to control, to repair the optics before the wound, rose in him and died just as quickly. What stood in its place was far rarer. "Truth. They were my guests," he said, "which means what they did happened under my name. I let you stand there alone while they decided who mattered in a room I paid for." He took another step, slow enough to stop if she wanted him to. "And the worst part is that I told myself I was protecting you by not making a scene." A bitter, disbelieving breath left her. Protecting me? No, he said, with quiet finality. Protecting myself. The words landed cleanly. No ornament, no evasions. For the first time that night, he was not asking her to be generous with his intentions. He was naming his failure exactly as it was. Clara's shoulders shifted, not softening, but settling into a steadier kind of hurt. Do you know what made it so humiliating? She asked. Not them. People like that always need someone smaller to stand on. It was that for 1 second. I thought you were going to cross the room. Her voice never rose. That made it cut deeper. And then you didn't. The room went still. Ethan lowered his head as if the sentence had struck somewhere physical. When he looked back up, the mask was gone completely. I heard what you said, he told her. A flicker passed through her face. Not fear. Exposure. By the garden wall. The whisper she had never meant for anyone powerful enough to change her life to hear. I know, he said. Every word. Color rose faintly in her cheeks, but she did not look away. Then you know I wasn't asking for pity. I know. His voice roughened. You weren't asking for anything from me. You were telling the truth when you thought no one important was listening. Something in Clara's expression shifted then. Not trust. Not yet, but the first crack in the certainty that she had been misread. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out the black velvet box his mother had pressed into his hand before dinner, the one everyone had assumed would make the evening simple. He looked at it for a moment, then set it down unopened on the table between them like evidence against himself. My mother wanted an announcement tonight, he said. The board wanted stability. My guests wanted a woman beside me who made sense on paper. Convenient family. Convenient future. Convenient smile. His eyes stayed on Clara's. I almost let all of them choose for me. Then, before she could answer, he turned, opened the door fully, and walked back onto the terrace. The sound of the party faltered in waves as heads turned. Candlelight flashed against crystal. A violin stuttered into silence. The terrace held its breath as he crossed back into the light. No one spoke. Not the women who had laughed too easily an hour ago. Not the men who had hidden their approval behind careful, polished expressions. Even the servers stood still along the edge of the stone floor, silver trays balanced in steady hands, as if the entire estate understood that something more than a party had just been interrupted. Something false was ending. He stopped at the center of the terrace, beneath the chandeliers, and between the long tables dressed in white linen and glass. The garden doors remained open behind him, and from where she stood inside the small room, Clara could see him clearly. For the first time that night, he did not look like a man speaking from height, wealth, or obligation. He looked like a man stripping all of that off because it was no longer worth hiding behind. I asked you here tonight, he said, his voice carrying across the silence without strain, because too many important decisions in my life have been made in rooms exactly like this. His gaze swept over the board members, the family friends, the polished faces that had spent years rewarding obedience and punishing honesty. I let appearances become a kind of law. I let comfort pretend to be wisdom. And I nearly made the worst decision of my life because it was the one all of you could understand. A few people lowered their eyes. One man reached for his drink and thought better of it. The violinist stood motionless near the garden arch, bow hanging at his side. Then he turned, not to the crowd, but toward the open doorway. Toward Clara. She had not moved. Her hands were still at her sides, though every muscle in her body seemed caught between old instinct and new disbelief. The room behind her was plain, almost stark, the kind of place where forgotten coats and extra place cards were stored during elegant evenings. Yet standing there, with the soft lamp at her shoulder and the noise of wealth fading around her, she looked like the truest thing in the house. When she believed no one could hear her, he said. She said she wished someone would choose her. The words landed with more force than any shout. Not because they were dramatic, because they were small, human, bare. The kind of sentence spoken only when a person has been disappointed enough to stop decorating pain. His eyes never left Clara's. I heard her, and I realized something that should have been obvious long ago. Being chosen is not charity. It is not rescue. It is not something one person grants another from a position of power. His voice lowered, but the silence held it perfectly. It is recognition. It is truth. It is seeing the person everyone else overlooked and understanding that your life is poorer without them in it. He stepped down from the terrace platform and crossed the distance slowly, leaving the center of the party behind him. No one dared interrupt. No one dared reframe the moment into something safer. When he reached the doorway, he stopped. Not because he doubted, because this time, he meant to ask with his whole heart. "Clara," he said, and her name in his mouth sounded nothing like an apology now. It sounded like a promise learning how to speak. "I am not asking you to stand beside me so this room can approve. I am not asking because I feel guilty or because I want to fix what should never have happened." His jaw tightened once, then softened. "I am asking because when you are near, I become the man I should have been without being told. Because your kindness has more courage in it than anything I've built. Because every future I almost accepted feels empty compared to one honest day with you." Clara's breath caught.